When was the last time you did something that made someone uncomfortable and you let it stay uncomfortable? Not something reckless, not something cruel, just something that was entirely yours. A boundary, a no, a want. And you didn't soften it, didn't explain it into something more digestible, didn't manage the other person's reaction until it felt safe again. If you're struggling to remember, that's not a coincidence. That's the shape of a life built around other people's comfort with who you are. Carl Jung spent his career studying what happens to the parts of a person that get exiled before they're old enough to consent to the exile. Not the violent parts, not the genuinely dangerous ones, the inconvenient ones, the anger that unsettled someone, the ambition that got called arrogant, the coldness that got called cruel, the wanting that got called too much. In Aion, he lays out what happens to that material once it's banished. It doesn't disappear. It goes somewhere. And it waits. Here's the part that should unsettle you. Jung didn't consider the fully good person, the one who never rages, never wants too loudly, never disappoints anyone, an example of moral success. He considered them one of the more dangerous configurations a psyche can take, because the capacity for darkness didn't vanish. It just went unsupervised. You've spent years being told that the person who never causes friction is the safest one in the room. What if that person is actually the one running on the least conscious control? This video is going to walk you through what Jung called the shadow, not as a concept you already half know and nod along to, but as a specific, locatable force operating in your life right now, in who you resent, in what exhausts you, in the version of yourself that only shows up when you're finally alone. You'll leave understanding exactly which parts of you were exiled, why, and what it actually looks like to let them back in. Not as permission to hurt people, but as the only real path to stopping the ones who've been quietly living off your diminishment. Because the alternative isn't peace. It's a slower, more thorough disappearance. And you already know what that feels like. A child does not banish his own anger for no reason. Something has to make it unsafe to keep. And by the time you're old enough to notice the anger is gone, you've usually forgotten there was ever a decision involved. That's the part of the shadow that gets flattened every time someone treats it as a metaphor for hidden evil, some clinical footnote, some villain's backstory. Jung, in Aion, describes the shadow as the material of the personal unconscious. Traits he calls, almost dismissively, easy enough to see through with a little honest self-criticism. Which tells you something. Most of what lives in the shadow isn't monstrous. It's competitive, it's sexual, it's blunt. It wants things without apologizing for wanting them. The only reason it reads as unspeakable is that somebody, once, needed it gone, and had the power to make that need feel like your fault. This is the mechanism worth sitting with longer than most people do. The exile was never a verdict on what you actually were. It was a convenience arrangement, negotiated by someone bigger than you, at an age when you had no leverage to negotiate back. The coldness that could have protected you got renamed cruelty by a parent who needed you softer. The ambition that could have built something got renamed arrogance by someone who needed you smaller and easier to manage. Nobody sat you down and explained the trade. You simply learned, the way children learn everything that matters, through consequence rather than conversation. That certain parts of you produced love and safety, and certain other parts produced withdrawal and punishment. So you kept a ledger, and the losing entries didn't get deleted. They got moved somewhere, you stopped checking. Here is where the ledger becomes traceable. There is almost always one trait in another person that doesn't just annoy you. It repels you, disproportionately, in a way the actual offense doesn't fully explain. A co-worker's bluntness that makes your jaw tighten. A friend's shameless ambition that you describe as exhausting, but privately can't stop noticing. Jung's clinical observation was blunt on this point. We see, with startling clarity and startling intensity, exactly what we have refused to see in ourselves. And the intensity is the tell, because ordinary dislike doesn't come with that much heat attached to it. The next time that specific, disproportionate repulsion shows up, the useful question isn't what's wrong with them. It's when you last wanted to do the exact thing they're doing and stopped yourself before anyone else had to. What makes this difficult to sit with is that the good version of you was never a discovery about your character. It was an engineering decision made under duress by someone too young to know it was optional. And an engineered structure holds only as long as the pressure that built it stays in place. The moment you start asking who actually benefits from you staying exactly this manageable, the structure stops feeling like your personality and starts feeling like what it always was, a room you were locked into from the outside before you had a key of your own. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. A man came to Jung after 25 years of a compulsion neurosis that had cut him off almost entirely from the world. At 45, cornered by the one truth he'd spent decades avoiding, he said something that Jung recorded almost verbatim, that he could never admit to himself that he had wasted the best 25 years of his life. Not that he hadn't wasted them, that he could never admit it. That distinction is the entire chapter. It wasn't the waste that destroyed him. It was the wall he'd built to keep from seeing it. A wall so complete that he could describe his own devastation to another person before he could describe it to himself. Jung's clinical point, and it's a harder one than it first sounds, was that this kind of self-blindness isn't rare or extreme. It's what happens, reliably, to anyone who builds a life around never being the villain of their own story. The shadow doesn't go quiet just because you've stopped looking at it. It keeps operating, through resentments you can't quite explain, through exhaustion that has no obvious cause, through the small cruelties you commit, and then immediately, sincerely, forget. The forgetting isn't dishonesty, it's structural. You cannot consciously account for what you've refused to consciously examine. This is why the person who never causes friction should worry you more than the person who occasionally does. Friction means the capacity for conflict still has a visible outlet. It surfaces, gets named, gets metabolized. Total agreeableness means that capacity hasn't vanished, because it can't vanish. It's gone somewhere with no supervision at all. Jung watched this pattern in his consulting room for decades and drew a conclusion most people never want to hear. The patients who did the most quiet damage to themselves and everyone around them weren't the ones wrestling openly with their own darkness. They were the ones most convinced they didn't have any. There's a specific way this shows up in a life, and it rarely announces itself as darkness. It shows up as the friend who is endlessly, exhaustingly accommodating, and who occasionally does something so subtly self-sabotaging or so quietly punishing to the people closest to them that nobody can quite locate where it came from, including them. It shows up as the version of you that can absorb any request, any imposition, any disrespect, without complaint, and then finds yourself inexplicably furious at something unrelated, 3 days later, at full volume, aimed at whoever happened to be standing nearby. If you want to find out how much of your own darkness is currently running unsupervised, don't look at the moments you consciously chose to be difficult. Look at the moments you swore you had no idea what came over you. That phrase, "no idea what came over me," is not an excuse. In Jung's terms, it's a confession. It's the shadow signing its own name to something you'd already decided you were incapable of doing. The goal was never to eliminate that capacity. It was never going to leave regardless. The only real choice was whether you'd be the one directing it, or the last one in the room to find out what it had done. Jung made a distinction here that most people skip past too quickly to notice. You do not make projections, you meet them. The unconscious does the projecting, not the conscious self standing there feeling certain it's finally seeing someone clearly. which means the moment you feel absolutely convinced that someone else is the entire problem, cruel, selfish, insufferable, and it's obviously them, not you, is exactly the moment least available to your own scrutiny. Not because you're weak-minded, because that's what a projection is built to do. It doesn't announce itself as a distortion. It arrives disguised as clarity. Picture the version of this that's easiest to miss. The co-worker who dismisses your idea in a meeting, and the flash of rage feels entirely proportionate, entirely justified, entirely about them. And maybe it partly is, but the size of the reaction, the version that keeps replaying at midnight, that gets rehearsed in the shower, that colors the rest of the week, has almost nothing to do with what actually happened in that room. Jung's word for what's underneath that gap was the projection-making factor, an unconscious force that isolates you from the world by replacing it, quietly and without your consent, with a replica of your own unrecognized face. He called what it produces a cocoon, not a wall, not armor, a cocoon, something soft and self-woven that you build without noticing you're the one spinning it, thread by thread, every time you explain someone's behavior using only their character and never your own unexamined material. The more of these threads accumulate, the harder it becomes to see through them, because each one feels, individually, like an accurate observation about a difficult person, rather than what it actually is, a piece of yourself, stitched onto someone else because it was unbearable to leave it stitched to you. This is why moral certainty about another person's failings should make you slightly suspicious of yourself, not more righteous. Not because the other person is innocent, often they aren't, but the emotional charge, the specific, personal, disproportionate heat you bring to their flaws, is not a reliable measure of what they did. It's a fairly reliable measure of what you've spent years refusing to do, or refusing to want, or refusing to become. The trait that enrages you the most in someone else is rarely a stranger. It's usually kin. There's a version of you that has been living inside other people for years, assigned to a difficult boss, an ungrateful friend, a partner who never appreciates anything you do for them. And every time you locate your own unwanted qualities out there instead of in here, the cocoon gets one thread thicker and the actual work gets postponed one more year. Jung was clear that this isn't dissolved through willpower or moral effort in the way ordinary self-improvement is. It requires something closer to betrayal of your own certainty. The willingness to consider, seriously, even for one relationship, that the person you're most furious with might be wearing something that belongs to you. What waits on the other side of that willingness isn't forgiveness of them. It's the return of something that was never really theirs to hold in the first place. Your own capacity for exactly what you hated in them, finally back where it can be used instead of just endured. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. None of this comes free. Every exiled trait still has to be guarded, and guarding takes energy, real, finite, daily energy that has to come from somewhere, because it doesn't generate itself out of nothing. Jung didn't frame repression as a one-time event, a door closed once in childhood and left shut. He described the psyche as an economy of energy, where nothing is ever simply eliminated, only displaced, and displacement has to be maintained. Keeping the anger down, keeping the ambition small, keeping the coldness disguised as warmth, isn't a decision you made once at 7 years old and then never thought about again. It's active, it's ongoing. It is, in a very literal sense, work, performed continuously, mostly outside your awareness, for decades. This is where the exhaustion so many people carry without explanation actually comes from. Not the visible kind, the kind with an obvious cause, a bad night's sleep, a hard week. The other kind. The bone-deep tiredness that shows up after a completely uneventful day, after a conversation where nothing objectively difficult happened, after simply existing around other people for a few hours without incident. That fatigue is rarely about the day. It's about what the day cost you to perform. Consider what it actually takes to keep the exiled material contained in a single ordinary interaction. Someone says something mildly disrespectful. The authentic response, sharp, immediate, unfiltered, has to be intercepted before it reaches your face. A second, more acceptable response has to be generated and installed in its place, fast enough that the delay isn't visible. And then afterward, the whole sequence has to be forgotten quickly enough that you can still believe you're simply a naturally patient person, rather than someone running a constant, invisible override. Multiply that by every interaction in a day. That's not patience, that's labor, and labor has a cost. The specific ache worth noticing is the one that shows up not during conflict, but during rest. The moment you finally sit alone at the end of the day and feel not relief, but a strange, hollow flatness, as though something is missing rather than something being finally at peace. That flatness is usually the sound of energy that had somewhere better to go and wasn't allowed to go there. It's the ambition that didn't get to build anything today, the anger that didn't get to protect anything today, the wanting that didn't get to ask for anything today. Still fully intact, still fully yours, just rerouted into the effort of appearing to not have it. What Jung's model implies, and rarely says outright, is that integration isn't primarily a moral project. It's an energy reclamation. Every ounce currently spent guarding the exile is an ounce unavailable for the things that actually build a life. Creation, decisiveness, the kind of presence other people can feel in a room. The version of you that finally stops paying that toll doesn't become reckless. It becomes, for the first time in years, adequately funded. Somewhere in this video, a misreading becomes possible, and it's worth stopping to name it directly. None of this is an argument for becoming crueler, colder, or more careless with other people. That would just be trading one unconscious operator for another. Jung's distinction here matters more than almost anything else in this material. He separated what he called relative evil, the personal, recognizable capacity for selfishness, anger, coldness, ambition, the ordinary human material sitting in the shadow, from what he called absolute evil, a far rarer and more disorienting encounter that most people never actually have to face. Integration, in his sense, was never about accessing the second thing. It was about finally being willing to look at the first thing without flinching, without the elaborate architecture of denial that turns ordinary human capacity into something you need help pretending you don't have. Looking at it changes what it can do. This is the part that gets lost when people hear shadow work and picture something closer to permission-giving, as if the goal is to unlock the anger, hand it the keys, and let it drive. That's not integration. That's just relocating the unconsciousness from one direction to another. A person who suddenly acts out every impulse they'd previously suppressed hasn't become free. They've become governed by the exact same unexamined force, just pointed outward instead of inward. Real integration is quieter and considerably harder. It means the anger is finally visible enough that you get to decide what happens with it, instead of discovering what it already did after the fact. This is also where the word villain earns its place, and it earns it precisely, not loosely. You will look like a villain to a very specific audience, the people who built their own comfort on the assumption that you would keep absorbing, keep softening, keep disappearing your own wants to keep the peace. To someone who has been quietly living off your diminishment, your sudden refusal to keep shrinking will not read as growth. It will read as betrayal. That reaction is not evidence you've done something wrong. It's evidence you've stopped doing the thing that was, for them, extremely convenient. There is a difference, and it is not subtle, between hurting someone and simply no longer letting them use you. The first requires no consciousness at all. The shadow does that automatically, given enough neglect. The second requires exactly what the last 5 parts have been building toward. Enough contact with your own capacity for coldness, for refusal, for wanting things without apologizing for the want, that you can choose it deliberately, in a specific place, for a specific reason, rather than have it leak out sideways at people who didn't deserve it, while the person who actually earned your refusal continues receiving your best behavior. So somewhere in the next day, there will likely be a small moment that asks something small of you. A favor, an accommodation, a request phrased as if saying no isn't really an option. That moment is not abstract. It's the first place any of this becomes real or stays exactly where it's always been. Theoretical, comfortable, and costing you everything it's always cost you. There is a version of your life that has been running in parallel this entire time, underneath the one everyone gets to see. Quieter, less cooperative, considerably less concerned with whether the room stays comfortable. It hasn't been waiting for permission. It's been waiting for you to stop mistaking its absence for its non-existence. What Jung actually offered was not a call to become someone harder. It was a diagnosis of a specific, ongoing cost. That every year spent keeping the exiled material invisible is a year spent financing someone else's comfort with a version of you that was never entirely true. The people who benefited from your agreeableness were never wrong to enjoy it. They simply never had to ask what it was costing you to provide. That's the part worth sitting with longer than the rest. Not the anger you've suppressed, not the ambition you've minimized, but the fact that an entire economy of relationships may have been quietly built around your willingness to keep paying into it. Parents, partners, friends, employers, all of them adjusted to a version of you that was manageable. And manageable is not the same thing as true. The moment that arrangement stops being profitable for them is the moment you find out how much of that closeness was ever actually about you, and how much was about the convenience of what you agreed to be. This is not an argument for becoming someone people struggle to love. It's a question about what exactly they've been loving. If the answer is a performance built to keep other people's discomfort at bay, then what looks like connection has actually been a very long, very quiet transaction. And transactions, unlike relationships, can be renegotiated. You don't have to do anything today to prove any of this. There's no ritual, no declaration, no single dramatic act of defiance required to become whole. What Jung's work suggests, patiently and without much comfort, is that the shift starts the first time you notice the moment arriving. The small request, the reflexive yes, the old machinery already reaching to soften you before you've even decided how you feel. And you let there be a half-second of friction where there used to be none. That's the whole beginning. Nothing more dramatic than that, and nothing less than that either. The rest of your life will keep asking the same question. It's been asking since before you had the language to answer it honestly. Whose comfort is this, really? And what has it cost you to keep providing it? You already know the answer, and if you're ready to stop paying it, say so below. Write, I choose the shadow over the performance, and mean it. If this landed the way it should, the video on your screen right now will too. Click to keep watching.